Now, here's a story that will affect many South Africans. Now, church leaders in South Africa have lately been making the news mostly for the wrong reasons. The CRL Rights Commission recently held a national summit with over 800 church leaders from across the country to address the issues that are plaguing the religious community. And many religious leaders were unhappy about the findings in the CRL's report titled Commercialisation of Religion and the Abuse of the People's Belief Systems. And these church leaders opposed the report and said that the CRL had a threatening tone. Now, joining us via Skype from Cape Town is Michael Swain from Freedom of Religion South Africa to talk to us about the national summit that was held last week. Michael, good morning and thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, Zakiri, and thank you for having me on your show.
You know, my first encounter with what happened here was from colleagues who went to cover this event, and they were flabbergasted and said they could not believe the tone in which this particular summit was conducted. What was your take on it?
I think to start off with, it's important to say that people did not oppose the CRL Rights Commission's report. In fact, it was a very important report that highlighted some of the issues that we're facing in the religious community. What was actually concerning was the recommendations which the CRL put forward, which was actually the regulation of religion by the state. So that was really, I think, what was the upsetting element of this particular issue. And I think some of those sentiments were made clear at the summit itself, which was perhaps why there was quite an elevated tone to that event.
So when you say that, can you just pinpoint the specific observation that actually makes that clear?
Well, the most important thing to recognize is that although the CRL Rights Commission were talking about regulating the religious space, it's important to notice that the space, the religious community, is already highly regulated. We live in a rule of law. Every church is subject to, or every religious community is subject to, for example, labor laws, banking laws, SARS regulations, zoning restrictions, etc. So it's not as if it's a kind of a free-for-all. What the issue seems to be, and I think is obviously very concerning, is that there are isolated instances of abuse which unfortunately has been very sensationalized in the public eye, which have given the, if you like, the branded, I think wrongly, the whole religious community with a very bad image. So I think we've got to understand as well that the vast majority of the religious communities makes a very valuable and important contribution to society as a whole, because we live, as you I'm sure are aware, in a very religious society. About 90% of people in South Africa do have some active faith.
Michael, when you say these are isolated incidents that are perhaps being blown out of proportion, is that not being reductionist about a problem that does seem to be proliferating?
Yes, it is a problem, but then what we believe is that the problem should be dealt with, and when you see it happening, is being dealt with effectively by our existing laws. So, for example, we've had, I'm sure some of the highlights that you would know would be, say, the Prophet of Doom. Well, he was duly charged with assault, which is a criminal offence, which is what he was committing, and convicted and has been sentenced accordingly. We are also looking at the Timothy Amatoza case. That's in court. The Prophet Bashiri case, that's in court. So what we were saying is that let's see the existing laws applied effectively, because when that happens, it resolves some of these cases, which are not actually religious abuses, they're simply criminal abuses, and they should be treated as such.
What about more statutory regulations, such as churches that run as businesses or run businesses as part of the church offering, and people maybe not adhering to tax laws in that regard? What's your take on that? Is that not something that needs to be more actively policed?
That is already regulated. So, for example, a church can register as a non-profit company. Some churches have, for example, bookshops, which they use to serve their communities with tapes and literature on the faith and that type of thing. And that's perfectly valid. And yes, if people are abusing that status and they're not paying SARS the tax that they do, then, of course, SARS should enforce that. And that's, again, the point made is that we live in a rule of law, and these laws simply need to be properly enforced. If there's issues, let's see proper law enforcement.
So, Michael, the religious leaders at the summit ultimately decided that they want to self-regulate. They want to address these problems themselves. But given what's happened and given what we are seeing as the public out there, you haven't been able to basically, regulate and take care of the ones who are rogue amongst you. So what are you going to do differently from here on?
I think importantly to note is that, in fact, in many of those cases, there were representatives from the religious community that did actually address the issues at grassroots level. But again, the religious community isn't the state. The state has a job and the religious community has a job. The state's job is to actually enforce the existing laws effectively and efficiently to deal with people who are committing criminal offences. I think where the problem gets a little tricky is when we start thinking about regulating perhaps practices that we don't necessarily agree with. So, for example, if somebody is saying that petals can turn into chocolate or something like that, well, that may be bizarre, irrational, and illogical. But the constitutional court's already decided that just because a belief is that doesn't mean to say that it's illegal or wrong. If it becomes criminal, then obviously that's another matter. And as I said, that's when the state needs to intervene and get involved and sort out the issues.
But as the religious community, do you have a set of rules by which you ought to abide by? Do you have a code of conduct, for example, for your members?
Well, number one, many of the more existing denominations have very clear constitutions and codes of practice and regulations that they have developed for themselves. And yes, there is already underway, which was initiated by the religious community in April last year, the development of a code of conduct which will be ultimately, we hope, approved, which is based upon the Religious Freedom Charter, which has already been accepted by 22 million people of the faith community. So that will be something which will be, I think, a very valuable benchmark, and that will be definitely part of the process which the religious community agreed and unanimously adopted at the summit last week that will now go forward. It will be a local, provincial and national process where we can really get to grips with the issues and come up with solutions developed by the religious community and for the religious community, which will, of course, be important to say voluntary and self-regulating in nature.
So just a final question to that last point that you make. How have, the religious leaders addressed to date some of the more bizarre church practices that we have seen?
The bizarre church practices, in as much as they're criminal, are unanimously condemned by the religious community. You cannot hide a criminal or an illegal act under the guise of freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is a very important constitutional right, but it has never been an excuse and will never be an excuse for committing an illegal act that is harmful or hurtful to somebody. So that is where I think we need to be very careful that we don't overstep that mark and start saying that just because maybe people are doing things which we might think are not necessarily acceptable or usual, they can still be valid, of course, as long as they're not criminal. So that's where we would say draw the line.
Michael Swain, thanks so much for your time this morning. And
Thank
Michael
you.
Swain is from Freedom of Religion South Africa, talking to us there about the National Summit for Church Leaders that was held in Johannesburg last week. I believe it was absolutely robust. And you are, of course, welcome to tell us your views on that as well at Morning Live SABC. That's our Twitter handle.